Assalamu alaikum. This is the 5th week of online teaching, and today in this HIST204, History of United States of America, we are going to discuss the World War II, and then we will continue. In the 1936 election, Roosevelt won a decisive victory over his Republican opponent, Alf Landon of Kansas. He was personally popular, and the economy seemed near recovery, and he took 60% of the vote. And Roosevelt's second term was a time of consolidation. The president made two serious political missteps: an ill-advised, unsuccessful attempt to enlarge the Supreme Court, and the second was a failed effort to purge increasingly unrest in Southern conservations from the Democratic Party. When he cut high government spending, moreover, the economic collapsed. These events led to the rise of a conservative coalition in the Congress and was unreceptive to new initiatives. The next 6 years, from 1932 to 1938, there were widespread public debate on the meaning of New Deal policies to the nation's political and economic life. Americans were very clear, and they wanted their government to take greater responsibility for the welfare of the ordinary man, however uneasy they might be about big government in general. So this New Deal established the foundations of the modern welfare state in the United States, as we talked in the last lecture. No American leader after Roosevelt has been so successful in using the radio. And in a radio address in 1938, Roosevelt declared democracy has disappeared in several other great nations, not because the people of those nations disliked democracy, but because they had grown tired of unemployment and insecurity, of seeing their children hungry while they sat helpless in the face of government confusion and government weakness through lack of leadership, unquote. And he concluded that Americans wanted to defend their liberties at any cost and understood, and I quote him, that the first line of the defense lies in the protection of economic security. With all these promises, while Roosevelt's second term was well underway, his domestic program was overshadowed by the expansionist design of totalitarian regimes in Japan, Italy, and Germany. In 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria, crushed Chinese resistance, and set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, enlarged its boundaries in Libya. In 1935, conquered Utopia. And Germany, under Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, militarized its economy and reoccupied the Rhineland. And in 1936, the area which was demilitarized by the Rhineland, the Versailles area. In 1938, Hitler incorporated Austria into the Germany and demanded secession of the German-speaking from Czechoslovakia. By then, war seemed imminent, and this was the Second World War. The United States was disillusioned by the failure of the crusade for democracy in World War I, and announced that in no circumstances could any country involved in the conflict look to it for aid. United States of America wished to remain neutral, but neutrality Legislation enacted piecemeal from 1935 to 1937 prohibited trade in arms with any warring nations, required cash for all other commodities, and forbade American flag merchant ships from carrying those goods. If you can recall, in World War I, America has turned itself into a war factory. The objective was to prevent almost any cost the involvement of the United States in a foreign war. And with the Nazi conquest of Poland in 1939 and the outbreak of World War II, isolationist sentiment increased, even though Americans clearly favored the victim of Hitler's aggression and supported the Allied democracies, Britain and France. Roosevelt could only wait until public opinion regarding US involvement was altered by events. After the fall of France and the beginning of the German Air War, again, Britain in mid-40, the debate intensified between those in the United States who favored aiding the democracies and the anti-war faction known as the isolationists. The way we are isolationists these days. Roosevelt did what he could to nudge public opinion towards intervention. The United States joined Canada in a mutual board of defense and aligned with the Latin American republics in extending collective protection to the nation in the Western Hemisphere. The 1940 president election campaign demonstrated that the isolationists, while vocal, were a minority. Roosevelt's Republican opponent Wendell Willkie leaned towards intervention. Thus, the November election yielded another majority for the president, making Roosevelt the first and the last US chief executive to be elected to a third term. Nobody have been a president for a third term in America after him. In early 1941, Roosevelt got Congress to approve the Lend-Lease program, which enabled him to transfer arms and equipment to any nation, notably Great Britain, later the Soviet Union and China. And it deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Total Lend-Lease by war's end would amount to more than $50,000 million. Most remarkably, in August he met with Prime Minister Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland. The two leaders issued a joint statement of war aims. This was earlier America's claim for neutrality, which they called the Atlantic Charter. Bearing a remarkable resemblance to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, it called for these objectives: no territorial aggrandizement, no territorial changes without the consent of the people consent, the right of all people to choose their own form of government, the restoration of self-government to those deprived of it, economic collaboration between all nations, and freedom from war, from fear, and from want of all peoples, freedom of the seas, and the abandonment of the use of force as an instrument of international policy. America was now neutral only in name. And then comes this Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and the war. While most Americans anxiously watched the course of the European war, tension mounted in Asia. Taking advantage of an opportunity to improve its strategic position, Japan boldly announced a new order in which it would exercise hegemony over all of the Pacific. Battling for survival against Nazi Germany, Britain was unable to resist abandoning its concession in Shanghai and temporarily closing the Chinese supply route from Burma. In summer 1940, Japan won permission from the weak government in France to use airfields in Northern Indochina, North Vietnam, which is we know it today. That September, the Japanese formally joined the Rome-Bernal Axis. The United States countered with an embargo on the export of scrap iron to Japan. In July 1941, Japanese occupied southern Indochina, South Vietnam these days, signaling a probable move towards the oil, tin and rubber of British Malay and Dutch East Indies. The United States in response froze Japanese assets and initiated an embargo on the one commodity Japan needed above all others, oil. In retaliation, on the morning of December 7, Japanese carrier-based planes executed a devastating surprise attack against the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 21 ships were destroyed or temporarily disabled, and 323 aircrafts were destroyed or damaged. 2,388 soldiers, sailors, and civilians were killed. However, the US aircraft carriers that would play such a critical role in the ensuing naval war in the Pacific were at sea and not anchored at Pearl Harbor. American opinion was still divided about the war in Europe. Now got unified overnight with what President Roosevelt called a day that will live in infamy. On December 8, Congress declared a state of war with Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. So this was like a mobilization for a total war. So the nation rapidly geared itself for mobilization of its people and its entire industrial capacity. And as a result of Pearl Harbor and the fear of Asian espionage, Americans also committed what was later recognized as an act of intolerance, the internment of Japanese-Americans. 63% of these Japanese-Americans were American-born US citizens. In 1983, only in 1983, this injustice was acknowledged by the US government. The Second World War was won because of the atom bomb. The victory came by devastating Japan's two big cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was on August 6 at a US plane, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. And August 9, a second atomic bomb was dropped, this time on Nagasaki. The bombs destroyed large sections of both cities with massive loss of life. And on August 14, Japan agreed to the terms set at Potsdam. On September 2, 1945, Japan formally surrendered. The realization of the full implication of nuclear weapons, awesome destructiveness, would come to United States and the nations later. Khuda Hafiz.